In today's session, we're going to concern ourselves with the figure of the warrior. And in doing so, we're going to approach this idea of the warrior in a much more specific and rigorous way than is normally associated with a notion that gets bandied around very loosely. In doing so, we will try to get at the interior experience of war, the way in which war is experienced by individuals who wage it, and the way in which war provides a source of meaning. In this sense, we will start to complexify the accounts that we've had of war and draw out some of the tensions between the political objectives and mandates of war, the technological constraints of conflict, and the internal reality for those who wage war. At a first brush, we might look at this concept of warrior along two main axes. We might think of the warrior as a mythical figure, one that we find present in almost every culture and civilization, a virtually universal concept, the individual whose primary purpose is to wage war. We could also think of the warrior as a psychological type, as having something to do with specific, uncommon individuals who possess a special kinship to war, one that marks them out from the broader political community and even most of their fellow soldiers. A figure, in fact, who recurs repeatedly in personal accounts of war and distinguishes themselves from those fighting alongside them. For instance, we find in the writings of Karl Marlantes, a Vietnam veteran and a published author, we find Marlantes expressing the idea that he considered himself a citizen soldier, and that most young men he served with in Vietnam were citizen soldiers as well. These individuals became warriors either by being volunteered or by being drafted, and would serve as such for the length of time that they were needed by their country. As soon as we could, he says, we left the military and returned home. Born warriors are different, though. For them, war is home. They like to fight. They, however, experience war not as something to endure, but as something meaningful to them, something they wanted to engage in more than anything else. And so it is to those individuals, those for whom war is more meaningful than anything else, that we are going to be most concerned with. Now, this figure of the warrior is, of course, in many ways troubling to us. Its mythical form might be seen as participating in a now rather outdated ideological romanticization of war, an idealization of war, one that we would want to put distance ourselves from. And in the psychological manifestation, the warrior is suspect of being an individual who rather loves war too much, who is conceivably bloodthirsty or psychopathic. And of course this is true, this discomfort is very real, because we've become used to thinking of war as, at best, a regrettable political necessity, something we engage in reluctantly, and certainly not something that we should revel in or valorize for its own sake. This, of course, in some ways distinguishes us from earlier cultures, which tended to elevate war as an inherently noble activity that was often reserved to an elite. Yet I would put to you that it is perhaps precisely because of this discomfort with this category of the warrior today that we should confront it, because of what this archetype tells us still tells us about war's inner life and our human condition. A very important distinction to make here is one drawn up by Christopher Coker between instrumental and existential dimensions of war. The instrumental dimension is the one we are most familiar and comfortable with, the one that we've been essentially studying so far. It is the conception that sees war as an instrument, war in the Clausewitzian formula as an extension of policy by other means. It has to do with the state rationalization of armed force, the means end calculus whereby force is deployed to attain a particular objective. As I say, this is something we are comfortable with because it's the way we in contemporary societies think of war primarily. We think of war as something that we sometimes have to do for political ends, but we should by no means pursue as an end in itself. Now, the existential dimension relates to the inner life of war, or what war means to those who commit to it. And the warrior in this conception is first and foremost the individual who finds existential meaning in war, who embraces the killing and the risk of being killed involved in war as a objective or as something that would be part of their life. In this sense, the warrior distinguishes themselves from the soldier. And we should, I think, for our purposes, be clear that there is a conceptual distinction here. Arguably, all warriors are soldiers, but not all soldiers by any means are also warriors. Not all soldiers have this profound existential commitment to war. Not all soldiers find war profoundly meaningful. If we were to look or cast our eyes in contemporary militaries as to where we might find the highest proportion of warriors, is arguably most likely in various special forces and elite corps that we would find them. But that's not to say that we might not necessarily recognize them either in other types of units. It's also worth noting here that we could also, of course, understand the concept of the warrior not as an absolute, but as an inherent tendency that might be common to all those who experience war. In other words, war is a complex subjective experience, often contradictory, and that within it we may recognize or identify elements of the warrior in ourselves, even if we are not wholly consumed by it, even if we do not commit ourselves as singularly as the warrior figure suggests. But it allows us to get to the experience of war beyond the merely political designs and objects that are given to it. So what do we mean exactly by an existential commitment? Here we need to refer back to the philosophical movement known as Existentialism, perhaps most emblematically led by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. For Sartre and other existentialists, human existence is not given meaning by some prior essence, by our family origins, our social origins, by our genes, or by any prior determination. Rather, our existence is given meaning by our own actions and decisions. Sartre insists on the radical freedom of human beings. We are born free, and any attempt to disavow this freedom, to point to determinations and other criteria or other structures or forces that might determine our existence, are acts of bad faith, where we deny ourselves our true freedom. This is the meaning of Sartre's famous phrase, that existence precedes essence. Now, crucially for existentialism, It is ultimately death, the knowledge of death, this unique awareness that humans have of their own finitude that gives meaning to life. It is because we know that we shall perish, that we shall disappear, that our time on earth is finite, that we must and we cannot but try and endeavor to give meaning to our lives. And of course, returning back to our concern with war, war is arguably uniquely life-affirming because it confronts death like no other human activity. In the context of existentialism, it also means that war must be a site of agency, a site in which actions and decisions made by the individual matter. This is expressed at one level through the skill of the warrior who shows their aptitude at fighting. But it also manifests itself through the accordance with certain principles that sustain a warrior's honor. This concept of honor is crucial to the notion of the warrior, for it is not merely killing, even killing with skill, that defines the warrior. There is a difference between waging war and engaging in massacre or murder. One has to fight in an honorable fashion, in a dignified fashion, in order to fulfill or to provide adequate meaning to the conduct of war. Moreover, one is above all honorable in the eyes of others. First and foremost, the community of warriors. A community which can extend even to the worthy adversary. In fact, there is a sense in which the warrior is only as honorable, only as virtuous, only as accomplished as the value of their adversary allows them to be. And so it's not surprising then that we find across warrior cultures and across historical eons a recurrent primacy given to the idea of a warrior code. For instance, a very detailed and insistent code is the Bushido warrior code prevalent within the traditional Japanese warrior communities. And these values have some cultural specificities and therefore some variety across time and space. But there is, in fact, quite remarkable consistency. Values of self-reliance, courage, duty, and integrity are generally found in all warrior cultures. Such cultures serve to bind warriors together in a common identity and within a long-standing warrior tradition. It has as one of its effects to frame violence within a moral compass, to determine what are permitted and even honorable forms of violence and which forms of violence are to be prohibited or considered dishonorable. Here we might want to make a distinction, an important distinction between code and law. We are talking here about a warrior code, which is an informal set of instructions, an aspirational guide. On the other hand, law is formal. Law is very specifically recorded in order to deal with a minutiae of cases and in order to provide a rigorous judgment of whether an action is legal or illegal. The much more informal code, on the other hand, provides a set of values, general values, which are then to be interpreted and applied in every single case by the warrior. And of course, there's no wonder that the code, in a sense, is a response to, in some sense, the ambiguity and moral dilemmas inherent to the battlefield, and an ambiguity and an ambivalence that must be resolved through the operation of the individual moral agency of the warrior. The warrior has to determine for themselves what will constitute an honorable action, what will be conform to the code. The important distinction here with law, again, is that conformity with a code means that one has to act in conformity with the spirit of the code. Whereas it is always possible, of course, to act upon the letter of the law. That certain actions can be deemed legal, even though on many levels they may seem to be in contradiction with the spirit of the law, the wider values or norms that have inspired the law. There is no sense in which one can be in act in the letter of the code. One is always in the spirit of the code. Now, one of the important issues we have to address is the potential for an uneasy relationship of the warrior with their specific commitments and their specific community with the wider political collectives they are part of. Perhaps even a tension with wider humanity as a whole. For instance, one could ask whether the warrior's personal quest for fulfillment, for defining personal meaning through war, might not enter into contradiction with the desires and interests of society. And so a follow-on question from this is whether the warrior code is something that is in harmony, or rather in tension, with the values and goals of a wider political community. A number of answers or responses to this have been provided. The ancient Greeks attempted to reconcile this through the notion of themos, or spiritness. What the Greeks meant by themos was the innate sense of justice and of what is right, that all in the community possess. All in the community can share equally in common indignation at violations of this sense of what is just. And therefore, if the honourable warrior acts in accordance with this spirit of themos, then he will act with it in accordance with the greater good and order of things. The private desire of the warrior to be honourable will be in accordance with the public good. But beyond this neat resolution, is there still not a tension between political necessity, and notably the state's instrumental uses of violence, and the warrior's existential understanding of war? Machiavelli, for instance, expressed the notion that a certain ruthlessness in war is required in the interests of the state. And here Machiavelli is merely expressing the familiar credo that sometimes the ends justify the means. That sometimes the state, the political collective, will need to pursue actions in the interest of that collective that might be considered dishonourable from the perspective of a warrior code. So here a tension already establishes itself potentially between what the community wants and what it feels is needed in order to achieve this, and what the warrior might want to pursue as part of their personal fulfillment. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche formalizes this, I think, this tension in a powerful way through his notion of the relationship of the state to the warrior. For Nietzsche, the figure of the warrior stands for the value creator, for the individual who carves their own path, who stands outside of the pious conformity of the herd, the rest of society, and by standing outside of the order of things, is able to establish new orders of values. You say it is the good cause that hallows even war. In other words, that the virtue of our cause is what makes war acceptable. I say unto you, rather, it is the good war that hallows any cause. It is war itself that sanctifies the cause. Elsewhere, he identifies the soldier as nothing else but the domesticated warrior. I see many soldiers, he says, would that I saw many warriors. Uniform, one calls what they wear. Would that what it conceals were not uniform. So for Nietzsche, the uniform, the homogeneity of the soldier within the state army is the symbol of the capture of the warrior by the state. Hence this idea that the state bites with stolen teeth. The warrior, in a sense, for Nietzsche, stands in opposition to the conformity of the modern state and its instrumental designs. And it is through its appropriation of the warrior, who has become in this configuration a mere soldier, that the state makes use of the warrior for its own ends. You could see this tension, this drama played out in the film Apocalypse Now through the archetypal figures of Colonel Kurtz and Captain Willard. The plot of Apocalypse Now is that Colonel Kurtz, on the right here, is presented to us as a great military leader, one who has been a great asset to the United States in its war in Vietnam, but one who has now disappeared into the depth of the Vietnamese jungle, is no longer responding to orders, and has established his own moral order, his own domain, his own reign outside, beyond the confines of the state. Captain Willard is accordingly sent into the depth of the jungle to find Kurtz, to attempt to bring him back into the fold of the state, or failing this, to dispose of him, which is what he eventually does. We also find in the writings of Jesse Glenn Gray, a philosopher and World War II veteran, a powerful account of this ambiguous figure of the warrior. Allow me to read from a short passage. In some few men, Glenn Gray tells us, the illusion of indestructibility is a function of an indomitable will to power, which refuses to recognize ordinary mortality. Such men have a fanatic faith in their destiny, which is only strengthened by narrow escapes and the sight of death in manifold forms. They are commonly leaders and win recognition as fearless warriors whose iron nerves and will to victory is out of all proportion to those of other men. Nothing but their own death will rob them of their illusion, and it is one of the mysteries of combat that they so rarely get killed. Gray here expresses something that we find in many accounts of war. These figures that appear, that stand out of the ordinary, somehow are identified as either fearless or particularly in tune with the spirit of war, in such a way that it isolates them, distinguishes them from the mass of the soldiers fighting along them. And these individuals, of course, are again, great assets to their side, but they are also in some ways profoundly problematic. Gray continues, little do these individuals have to recommend them as friends or comrades. As a rule, they are vain and empty, contemptuous of all who are not like themselves. Battle appears to be their very element, and in that element, men will not hesitate to pay them homage. If their vitality and their will are admirable in themselves, there is little that is specifically human about their whole mentality. They hardly recognize other men as such and are capable of walking over bodies, living or dead, without a qualm. Finally, we find another version of the warrior, in a sense, in the work of the thinker Frantz Fanon, the post-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon. Fanon does not necessarily evoke the warrior per se, but he is getting again at this idea of agency and existence through war. Fanon was profoundly influenced by Sartre and the Existentialists. And Fanon was concerned, writing in the early years after the Second World War, with the movement of decolonization. And much of which happened, of course, through various versions of armed struggle. But Fanon underlined that in order to enact decolonization, the colonized would have to struggle for it, and in doing so perform an act of authentic self-affirmation. That it would be through armed resistance that individuals would acquire historical agency. The colonized man, he says, finds his freedom in and through violence. Now, crucially, what Fanon is saying here is that he's not merely claiming that we need to overthrow the colonizers in order to attain the goal of self-governance. He is saying that the act of resistance itself is transformatory at the existential level, at the level of historical consciousness. As he puts it, at the level of individuals, I'm quoting here, violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. In other words, decolonization cannot be truly achieved through a merely instrumental use of violence. It may be, of course, necessary to remove politically the institutions of colonization. But without the performance of that historical act of agency, without a recovery of a sense of affirmation, individuals will never be free of their colonial chains, Fanon is saying. And so once again, through Fanon, we get to the idea of violence not merely as a means to an end, but as an experience that profoundly transforms those who carry it out. As, in other words, as violence as an existential act.